The morning I met Dr. Samuel Werner, frost still clung to the windows of his cabin like desperate fingers. It was October 2019, in the remote forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, 3 miles beyond where the logging roads turn to game trails, and the cell signal dies completely. I had driven 9 hours from Detroit following coordinates he'd sent encrypted through a secure server. The air smelled of wet pine bark and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance a raven's call echoed through the valleys like a warning. I'm a conservation biologist by training, but that day I arrived as something else, a listener, a witness to testimony I still struggle to categorize. Dr. Werner had been a wildlife geneticist at the University of Wisconsin until 1994, when he disappeared from academic life without explanation. His colleagues assumed burnout, perhaps a personal crisis. His family accepted his retreat into solitude as the eccentricity of a brilliant mind seeking peace. No one suspected the truth. What I found that morning wasn't a hermit or a madman. I found a scientist who had spent 25 years documenting something that wasn't supposed to exist, a creature that walked the boundary between canine and human, between myth and biology. His cabin walls were covered not with conspiracy theories or blurred photographs, but with meticulous field notes, genetic sequencing charts, behavior logs spanning decades, and thousands of hours of audio recordings stored in climate-controlled cases. "They'll come for this eventually," he told me, gesturing to the archive surrounding us. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from Parkinson's disease that had begun to steal his coordination. When they do, someone needs to know the whole story, not the sensational version, the real one. 3 weeks after my visit, federal agents raided his property. The official report cited illegal wildlife research and failure to report endangered species contact. Dr. Werner was taken into custody, his life's work seized and classified. He died 6 months later in a VA hospital, the official cause listed as pneumonia complications. But before they came, he told me everything. He showed me everything. And now, as his executor and the keeper of his digital testimony, I'm obligated to share what he discovered in those woods, not because it's sensational, but because it's true, and because the question it raises is more important than the answer. What do we owe to intelligence we don't understand? Dr. Werner's routine had remained virtually unchanged for 25 years. He woke before dawn, regardless of season, and began each day reviewing the previous night's recordings. He had established a network of 63 trail cameras and 47 audio monitoring stations throughout a 12-square-mile territory he called the study area, a carefully mapped region of old-growth forest, wetlands, and limestone ridges that had somehow escaped both logging and development. His cabin, built by hand over his first 3 years in the wilderness, served as both home and research station. The structure was modest, 800 square feet of rough-hewn timber with a wood stove, a single bedroom, and what he called the archive room. Solar panels on the roof powered his computer equipment, backup drives, and the small refrigerator where he kept medical supplies and film. A hand pump well provided water. He grew vegetables in the summer, hunted deer in the fall, and ice fished through the winter. "People assume isolation equals loneliness," he explained to me, brewing coffee on his wood stove, but I was never alone here. I was observed, studied in return. It took me 3 years to understand that. The territory he monitored represented prime habitat for the creature he'd come to study, terrain biologists call an ecotone, where multiple ecosystems converge. Here boreal forest met northern hardwood, wetlands fed into rivers, and limestone caves provided shelter that remained temperature-stable year-round. The region supported healthy populations of white-tailed deer, black bear, and wild turkey. It was isolated enough that human presence remained minimal. Hikers occasionally, hunters during season, but otherwise undisturbed. Dr. Werner's methodology was rigorous, borrowed from his years studying wolf pack dynamics and primate behavior. Each morning he downloaded data from his remote monitoring stations, a process that took approximately 2 hours. He logged every entry into a master database he'd designed himself, cross-referencing dates, weather conditions, lunar phases, prey animal movements, and any anomalous recordings. "The pattern is everything," he said, showing me his color-coded spreadsheets. "Anyone can catch a strange sound or a blurred image, but patterns reveal behavior, and behavior reveals intelligence." His afternoons were spent in the field, checking equipment, maintaining the monitoring network, and conducting what he called passive observation. He would situate himself downwind at specific vantage points and simply wait. sometimes for 6 or 8 hours without moving. He never baited, never called, never attempted direct contact. The first rule of studying an apex predator that doesn't want to be studied is respect, he told me. You don't pursue. You don't provoke. You make yourself a predictable, non-threatening presence in the landscape, and you wait for trust, or at least tolerance, to develop. The forest itself became my education during my visit. Dr. Werner taught me to read it the way he had learned, not as scenery but as a living text. The scratch marks on certain birch trees positioned 7 feet high, the deliberate arrangement of stones near creek crossings, the deer trails that showed consistent avoidance patterns in specific areas, despite abundant browse. Wolves established territory through scent marking and howling, he explained as we hiked through morning mist. Bears mark trees at shoulder height, but this species uses multiple communication methods: visual markers, strategic positioning of objects, and vocalizations that mimic other animals to mask their presence. He showed me a site he'd documented for 15 years, a natural clearing where 3 game trails converged. At the center stood an old white pine, scarred by lightning years ago, but still alive. Around its base, stones had been arranged in a rough circle. Not naturally. The shapes were wrong, the spacing too deliberate. I've watched this site through seasonal cycles, he said quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. The arrangement changes. Stones are added, removed, repositioned. It's not random. There's intention here, though I can't claim to understand the purpose. Territory marker, memorial, communication between individuals. I document, but I don't presume to interpret. His evenings were dedicated to analysis and documentation. He would review the day's recordings, transcribe field notes into his digital archive, and compare current data against historical patterns. Once a week, he performed equipment maintenance. Once a month, he made a supply run to the nearest town, a 40-mile drive where he spoke to no one beyond transactional necessities. I couldn't risk attention, he said. One curious person, one social media post about the hermit in the woods, and the study would be compromised. Bureaucracy follows attention. I needed invisibility. His scientific isolation was complete but purposeful. He had no colleagues, no peer review, no institutional support. Everything he discovered remained unverified by the academic standards he'd once lived by. This bothered him deeply. I could see it in the way he organized his data, the meticulous methodology, the careful adherence to protocols that no one would ever officially recognize. I'm not asking you to believe me based on authority, he said that first evening, as darkness fell outside, and his cabin filled with the warm glow of kerosene lamps. I'm asking you to examine the evidence with the same rigor you'd apply to any field study. Look at the data, listen to the recordings, follow the methodology, then tell me what conclusion best fits the evidence. He handed me a pair of headphones connected to his computer. Before I show you anything visual, I want you to hear something, he said. This was recorded in November 1997, my 3rd year here. It's what convinced me I wasn't studying a known species. He pressed play, and through the headphones came the sound of the Michigan forest at night. Wind through pine boughs, the distant gurgle of a creek, an owl calling. Then, something else. A vocalization that started low and guttural, rose to a howl that held complex tonal variations, then descended into what I can only describe as syllabic patterns. It lasted 18 seconds. I've compared this to every known North American canid vocalization, Dr. Werner said. Wolf, coyote, fox, domestic dog across 47 breeds. I've consulted, anonymously, with bioacoustics specialists, sent them isolated samples without context. No match. The vocal structure suggests a larynx capable of both canid and primate-like articulation. He paused, meeting my eyes in the lamplight. That's not the remarkable part. The remarkable part is what happened next. He advanced the recording 30 seconds. Another vocalization, different in pitch and pattern, clearly responsive to the first. Then silence for 2 minutes. Then a third voice, higher, shorter in duration. 3 individuals, Dr. Werner said quietly. Communicating, coordinating. This is language, even if we can't understand it. The first physical evidence Dr. Werner collected came in his 2nd winter, February 1996. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, 8 inches of powder with no wind, perfect tracking conditions. He had been checking his northernmost monitoring station when he found the prints. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes just staring, he recalled, showing me the photographs he'd taken that morning. now preserved in archival quality sleeves. Part of me wanted to rationalize it away. Bear with an unusual gait, human in elaborate costume, anything that fit existing categories. The photographs showed a trail of prints in pristine snow, each impression approximately 14 inches long and 7 inches wide at the forefoot. The stride length measured between 48 and 52 inches, longer than human, longer than bear. But the most striking feature was the structure, 5 digits including an opposable hallux, suggesting grasping capability, but with claw impressions and pad morphology distinctly canid. "I made plaster casts," he said, retrieving one from a storage cabinet. "The weight in my hands was substantial, the detail precise. I sent anonymous samples to 3 comparative anatomy labs under the guise of being a graduate student working on evolutionary morphology. All 3 confirmed they couldn't match it to known species. One suggested I'd created a hoax. Another posited it might be a deformity or hybrid anomaly. The third simply said the structure was biologically improbable." That same winter, he found the first shelter site, a natural overhang in a limestone ridge, approximately 30 feet deep and 15 feet high at the entrance. The site showed signs of repeated use. Compacted earth worn smooth, fire-blackened stones arranged in a pit, and what appeared to be bedding material, dried grass and pine boughs deliberately gathered and arranged. "I didn't enter," he said firmly. "That would have been a violation. I documented from outside, set up a remote camera 50 yards away and left. The ethical line is crucial. This wasn't my home to investigate. It was theirs." The camera captured activity over the following months. In March, a figure appeared briefly at the overhang entrance, bipedal, approximately 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur with a distinctly canid head structure. The image quality was poor, backlit by morning sun, but the posture was unmistakable. Upright, balanced, intelligent. "I watched that 10-second clip maybe 1,000 times," Dr. Werner said. "I analyzed the proportions, the movement mechanics, the way it paused to scan the surroundings before retreating into the shelter. Everything about it suggested behavioral complexity." Over the following years, he documented 7 more shelter sites within the study area, each carefully mapped and monitored without intrusion. The sites showed consistent features: proximity to water sources, southern exposure for solar warming, strategic visibility of surrounding terrain, and evidence of long-term maintenance. "They weren't dens in the animal sense," he explained. "These were dwellings, maintained and modified over seasons. I found tool use, stones used to scrape hides, branches stripped for specific purposes. At one site, I found the remains of a carefully butchered deer, every usable part harvested, bones cracked for marrow using stone implements. The efficiency suggested both intelligence and cultural transmission of technique." But Dr. Werner's most significant discovery came in the form of what he called the offering incidents. These began in his 4th year, after the creature or creatures had apparently become habituated to his presence. He found the first offering in October 1997, a deer hide, tanned and folded, left on a flat rock 20 yards from his cabin. The placement was deliberate, weighted with a smooth river stone to prevent it from blowing away. "I didn't touch it for 3 days," he said. "I documented it, photographed it from multiple angles, ran through every possible natural explanation. But the tanning process alone, that requires knowledge of chemistry, timing, and technique. That hide had been scraped, treated, dried, and softened. That's craft, not instinct." He eventually accepted the hide, leaving in exchange smoked fish he'd prepared. A week later, the fish was gone, replaced by a bundle of medicinal plants: yarrow, elderberry, and wild ginger, plants known to indigenous peoples for their healing properties. "This was communication," Dr. Werner said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Not language-based, but communicative nonetheless. An acknowledgement of coexistence, an establishment of reciprocity. They were saying, "We see you, we understand your presence, and we choose tolerance." The exchange continued for years, irregular but consistent. Dr. Werner would leave food, never processed, always natural items like fish, venison, or foraged plants. In return, he would receive furs, woven grass mats, carved wooden objects, or arrangements of feathers and stones that held no utilitarian value he could determine, but possessed undeniable aesthetic quality. "Art," he said simply, showing me a collection of these items, or at least aesthetic expression. which implies abstract thought, cultural values beyond pure survival. However, this careful relationship existed within boundaries that were firmly maintained. Dr. Werner learned these limits through careful observation and a few cautionary incidents. In 2003, he attempted to leave a trail camera positioned to capture the exchange site. The camera was destroyed within hours, not smashed violently, but systematically dismantled, its components separated and left in a neat pile. The message was clear. Observation was tolerated. Surveillance was not. They understood technology, he said. They recognized the camera as a recording device and rejected it. That level of understanding is profound. It means they comprehend being observed and choose when to allow it. Similarly, when he once attempted to follow tracks too aggressively after a snowfall, he found himself suddenly surrounded by 3 individuals who had circled behind him. He never saw them directly, only heard their movements in the brush, their coordinated vocalizations, the clear message that he had crossed a line. I sat down immediately, he recalled, dropped my pack, spread my hands, made myself small and non-threatening. I stayed there for an hour while they circled me, assessing. When they finally withdrew, I returned to the cabin and didn't venture into that sector for a month. I had violated their boundaries and they corrected me without violence. That restraint, that proportional response, that's not animal behavior, that's judgment. These interactions convinced Dr. Werner that he was studying not a creature but a person, or more accurately, persons of a non-human species. This realization transformed his research from cryptozoology to something closer to anthropology, with all the ethical implications that entailed. The moment that changed everything came on September 15, 2002, during a rare cold snap that brought early frost to the Upper Peninsula. Dr. Werner had been conducting his evening equipment check at dusk when he heard sounds from the creek bed below his monitoring station. Not the vocalizations he'd recorded hundreds of times, but something different. Distress. The sound was wrong, he told me, his hands gripping his coffee mug tightly as he remembered. High-pitched, irregular, repetitive, pain vocalization. I've heard enough wounded animals to recognize suffering. He approached carefully, using the failing light and wind direction to mask his presence. What he found in the creek bed would become the most detailed observation in his entire archive. A juvenile, perhaps equivalent to a human adolescent, had caught its leg in a deadfall trap. An illegal snare likely set by poachers targeting bear. The wire had cut deep into the lower leg, and the creature's attempts to free itself had only tightened the mechanism. It was sitting partially in the creek, water flowing around it clearly in shock. My first thought was medical, Dr. Werner said. I have veterinary training from my wildlife research background. I could see infection risk, circulation compromise, hypothermia setting in. Every instinct said intervene. But before he could move, 2 adults emerged from the forest, both approximately 7 feet tall, powerfully built, moving with purpose. They approached the juvenile carefully, and what Dr. Werner witnessed over the next 43 minutes was behavior that would forever change his understanding of this species. They didn't panic, he said. The first adult, I believe female based on build and behavior, went directly to the juvenile, made physical contact, vocalizing in what I can only describe as reassuring tones. Low, steady, rhythmic. The juvenile's distress calls decreased. Meanwhile, the second adult, larger, likely male, examined the trap mechanism. What happened next was something Dr. Werner captured on his handheld video recorder, footage he showed me that day in his cabin. The quality was poor, shot in failing light from 80 yards distance, but the behavior was unmistakable. The larger adult studied the trap for approximately 2 minutes, testing the wire's tension, examining how the mechanism functioned. Then, using a piece of branch as a lever and working with deliberate precision, he systematically dismantled the snare, not through brute force but through understanding of basic mechanical principles. Leverage, tension points, release mechanisms, tool use with understanding of physics, Dr. Werner narrated as we watched. Watch how he positions the branch. That's not trial and error. That's problem solving, spatial reasoning, mechanical comprehension. Once freed, the juvenile couldn't put weight on the injured leg. The wire had cut to the bone, and the limb was already swelling. The female carefully examined the wound, then did something remarkable. She went to the creek bank and returned with a handful of moss, which she pressed firmly against the wound to stem the bleeding. Wound care. Dr. Werner said quietly. Using absorbent material to control hemorrhage. That's medical knowledge. The male then gathered sturdy branches and, using strips of bark, created a rudimentary splint for the injured leg. The juvenile vocalized during the process but remained still, clearly understanding the purpose of the intervention. Cooperative medical treatment, Dr. Werner continued. Division of labor based on skill, comfort behavior to manage pain. And the juvenile's compliance that suggests cultural transmission of medical knowledge, trust in adult expertise, understanding of healing processes. But the most profound moment came next. As the adults prepared to move the juvenile, the male suddenly stopped and turned, looking directly at Dr. Werner's hiding position. The eye contact, even through binoculars, was unmistakable. He knew I was there, Dr. Werner said, his voice carrying the weight of that moment even 17 years later. The whole time he knew. They'd allowed me to witness this because they needed me to understand something about them, about who they were. The male held the gaze for perhaps 10 seconds, then made a deliberate gesture, placing one hand over his chest, then extending it toward Dr. Werner in what could only be interpreted as acknowledgement. A bridge across the species divide, a moment of mutual recognition. Then they lifted the juvenile between them and disappeared into the forest, their movements coordinated and careful, protecting the injured limb. Dr. Werner remained in his observation position for another hour, processing what he'd witnessed. When he finally returned to his cabin, he didn't sleep. Instead, he spent the night transcribing every detail, reviewing the video frame by frame, documenting what he now understood to be the most significant cryptozoological observation in modern history, not because it proved the species existed, but because it proved they were people. I crossed a line that night, he told me. I could no longer maintain scientific objectivity. How do you objectively study someone who shows you their wounded child and allows you to witness their love, their fear, their medical knowledge? I wasn't observing specimens anymore. I was a neighbor, trusted despite our differences, allowed to see their vulnerability. 3 days later, he found an offering at his cabin, a piece of shed antler, carved with what appeared to be deliberate markings. Not random scratches, but patterns that suggested symbolic representation. Thank you, Dr. Werner said simply. Across the species barrier, with no shared language, they said thank you for staying back, for not interfering, for showing restraint when intervention might have seemed compassionate. They were telling me they understood my presence that night had been motivated by concern, and they appreciated my respect for their autonomy. He kept that carved antler in a place of honor on his desk next to his computer. When I held it that day in 2019, I could see the patterns, a series of lines that might have represented trees, or fingers, or tally marks. The meaning was ultimately unknowable, but the intention behind the carving was clear: communication, recognition, relationship. After that night, Dr. Werner said, I stopped being a researcher studying animals. I became a witness to another form of intelligence, another way of being human in the deepest sense of that word, capable of reason, compassion, culture, and choice. The months following the creek bed incident forced Dr. Werner into the most difficult ethical territory of his career. He had documented evidence that would revolutionize cryptozoology, validate decades of sightings, and prove the existence of a non-human intelligent species in North America. The scientist in him understood the magnitude of the discovery, but the person he had become understood something more important: what that revelation would cost the beings he'd grown to respect. I spent weeks drafting a paper, he confessed, showing me files on his computer filled with technical language, methodology descriptions, and carefully analyzed data. I wrote and rewrote, trying to find a way to share the discovery without exposing them to the consequences. Every version I completed made me sick to my stomach. The fundamental problem was inescapable. Any official documentation would trigger exactly the kind of attention that would destroy the study population. Federal agencies would declare jurisdiction. Scientists would flood the area. Media would descend. Well-meaning conservationists would advocate for protection that required constant monitoring. Hunters and thrill seekers would see challenge and trophy. Private collectors would offer bounties for capture. I contacted 3 colleagues anonymously, Dr. Werner explained. People I'd trusted during my academic career. I presented hypothetical scenarios. What if a researcher discovered an unknown intelligent species? What would be the proper protocol? All 3 gave the same answer: immediate documentation and reporting to federal wildlife agencies. It's the law, its ethical obligation in their framework. But Dr. Werner had read enough history to understand what protection often meant for indigenous populations encountering dominant cultures: displacement from traditional territories, forced integration or isolation, loss of autonomy in the name of preservation. The creature in the zoo, however well maintained, was still caged. "I thought about the Cherokee removal," he said, "the residential schools for indigenous children, the Japanese internment camps. Every time the government has decided they need to protect or manage a population, the outcome has been trauma. Why would this be different?" His personal observations had shown him a population that was stable, sustainable, and successfully avoiding human conflict through intelligence and adaptation. They weren't endangered by natural factors. They were endangered by discovery. His silence wasn't neglect. It was the most profound form of protection he could offer. Yet the silence carried its own costs. Hikers occasionally reported encounters, describing terrifying experiences that law enforcement dismissed as misidentification or hoaxes. When a bow hunter claimed he'd been stalked in 2006, game wardens found no evidence and chalked it up to imagination amplified by isolation. Dr. Werner knew the truth. The hunter had ventured near a known shelter site during what appeared to be a birthing season and had been warned away through intimidation display. "I could have confirmed these reports, provided context that would reduce fear," he said. "Instead, people left those woods traumatized, unable to convince anyone of what they'd experienced. That bothered me. But the alternative, turning their accounts into validated sightings, would have been worse." The ethical calculus became even more complex in 2008, when a local teenager disappeared during a camping trip. The search lasted 3 weeks, involving hundreds of volunteers and multiple agencies. The boy was eventually found 12 miles from his last known location, dehydrated and suffering exposure, but alive. He told searchers he'd been carried and watched over, but couldn't describe by what or whom. Medical professionals attributed this to trauma-induced confusion. Dr. Werner's monitoring stations had captured audio that suggested a different story. Vocalizations consistent with the species he studied, concentrated in the area where the boy was found, spanning the 3-week period. The pattern suggested surveillance, possibly protection. "They saved him," Dr. Werner said with certainty. "A human child, lost in their territory, and instead of viewing him as threat or ignoring his presence, they monitored him, maybe even guided him toward the eventual rescue location. But how could I explain knowing that? How could I reveal that information without exposing them?" He said nothing. The boy recovered. The incident was filed away as a fortunate rescue, and the truth remained hidden in Dr. Werner's encrypted files. These accumulating secrets created a psychological burden that he documented in personal journals, entries I later found in his archive, written in moments of doubt and exhaustion. March 12, 2009. "I am the keeper of truth that serves no purpose being revealed. I am the guardian of beings who don't know I've appointed myself their protector. The arrogance of that position isn't lost on me. Who made me judge of what knowledge should exist in the world? But having seen what I've seen, having received the trust I've been given, however one-sided it might be, I can't unknow it. And knowing it, I can't betray it. This is the loneliness of witness." By 2010, Dr. Werner had made his decision permanent. He would continue documenting everything with scientific rigor, but the archive would remain sealed during his lifetime. He created a complex series of dead man switches, encrypted files that would only become accessible under specific conditions, backup systems scattered across multiple secure locations, and a designated trustee who would inherit the responsibility of deciding what, if anything, should eventually be revealed. "I'm not saying the world should never know," he explained to me. "I'm saying that decision needs to outlive me, needs to be made in a context where the immediate threats might be different, where cultural understanding of intelligence and consciousness might have evolved. Maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100, humanity will be ready to know without needing to possess, to study without needing to control." He paused, looking out his cabin window at the forest that had been his life for a quarter century. Or maybe the secret stays secret forever. Maybe they go extinct without official acknowledgement and my archive becomes a curiosity, evidence of something lost, studied too late. That possibility haunts me. But the alternative, contributing to their destruction through revelation, that would be unforgivable. The weight of this choice was visible in his face, in the lines around his eyes, in the way his hands trembled with more than just Parkinson's disease. He had spent 25 years as the only human who knew, And that knowledge had cost him everything: his career, his family connections, his place in the scientific community he'd loved. Some discoveries, he said finally, aren't meant to be celebrated. They're meant to be carried. The full complexity of the species situation became clear to Dr. Werner during the winter of 2012-2013 when he documented what he came to call the teaching sequence, a series of observations that revealed not just intelligence, but culture, education, and what could only be described as ethical framework. It began in late November when his remote cameras captured a juvenile, perhaps the equivalent of a human 8-year-old, being instructed by an adult in what appeared to be hunting techniques. The footage, shot over multiple days, showed deliberate pedagogy, the adult demonstrating tracking methods showing how to read deer trails, how to move silently through snow, how to position oneself downwind. It wasn't just imitation learning, Dr. Werner explained, showing me the compiled video. Watch the adult's body language. He's teaching, not just allowing observation. He pauses, waits for the juvenile to attempt the technique, then corrects. That's instruction. That's education. But what struck Dr. Werner most was what happened when the juvenile successfully tracked and caught a rabbit. Rather than allowing the kill, the adult intervened, releasing the rabbit unharmed. I watched that sequence maybe 500 times trying to understand it, he said. The juvenile had the skill, had the opportunity, but the adult stopped the kill. And then, watch this. He takes the juvenile to a different location where an injured deer was bedded down, clearly dying from what appeared to be a vehicle strike from the distant highway. The adult gestured between the released rabbit and the dying deer, a clear comparative demonstration. Then he allowed the juvenile to perform the kill, swift, precise, minimizing suffering. He was teaching ethics, Dr. Werner said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Don't kill what's healthy and can escape. Don't create suffering unnecessarily. Take only what's already compromised, what's dying anyway. That's not instinct. That's moral reasoning, transmitted through cultural teaching. This observation led Dr. Werner to review 15 years of hunting documentation with new understanding. He found consistent patterns. The species primarily scavenged from natural deaths and vehicle strikes, hunted opportunistically but selectively, and showed clear preference for taking weak or injured prey. The hunting territory they maintained supported healthy populations of deer, turkey, and other species. The presence of the cryptids actually appeared to improve ecosystem health by removing diseased and injured animals before they could spread pathogens. They're keystone species, Dr. Werner concluded. Not apex predators in the typical sense, but regulatory presence that maintains balance. The forest is healthier because they're here. Another profound observation came in spring 2014, when Dr. Werner witnessed what he could only describe as a burial ceremony. An elderly individual had died. He found the body in one of the shelter sites, clearly deceased from natural causes given the lack of injury or distress signs. Over the following 3 days, 6 individuals came to the site. Each approached the body, made physical contact, touching the face, the hands, the chest, and vocalized in patterns that carried unmistakable emotional weight. Low, mournful, complex. I've heard elephant mourning behaviors, Dr. Werner said quietly. Corvids holding gatherings around dead companions. This was similar, but more structured. They were saying goodbye. They were performing ritual. On the 4th day, 4 adults returned and carried the body to a location 2 miles away, a natural depression surrounded by white pines. They buried the body carefully, covering it with earth and stones, then marked the site with a cairn and what appeared to be carved wooden posts. A grave, Dr. Werner said simply. Deliberate burial, ritual marking, return visits over subsequent months. They remember their dead. They honor them. That's not animal behavior. That's human behavior in the deepest sense. The recognition that individual lives have meaning beyond their biological function. He documented 7 more burial sites over the following years, all maintained with similar care. Some appeared decades old, the markers weathered but still deliberately placed. But perhaps the most significant ethical observation came in 2016, involving Dr. Werner himself. He had developed a severe infection after cutting his hand on equipment. Sepsis was setting in, and in his remote location, he was days from medical intervention. In his fever, he'd collapsed outside his cabin, unable to reach his emergency radio. I have gaps in my memory, he admitted, but I know I was moved, carried into my cabin, placed near the wood stove. When I regained consciousness, the fire had been fed, water had been placed within reach, and he paused, emotion thick in his voice. My wound had been cleaned and packed with medicinal moss, the same moss I'd seen them use 15 years earlier in the creek bed. Evidence remained. Muddy prints on his cabin floor, far too large for human, the door left open, his medical kit disturbed but not ransacked, only the antiseptic and bandages removed. They saved my life, he said. An injured human, defenseless in their territory, and they chose compassion. No exploitation, no aggression, no indifference. They rendered aid and withdrew. That's ethical behavior that transcends species. That's recognition of consciousness, suffering, and the obligation to prevent death when you have the capacity. After he recovered, he found an offering at his usual exchange site, his antiseptic bottle empty but carefully cleaned, returned with a bundle of the same moss they'd used on his wound. A clear message. We used this. We're returning your property. Here is our equivalent. Reciprocity, property rights, respect for resources, Dr. Werner cataloged. Every interaction revealed another layer of social complexity, ethical reasoning, cultural practice. I wasn't studying animals anymore. I was observing a civilization, small, hidden, precarious, but unmistakably sophisticated. These observations forced him to confront the full weight of his silence. He wasn't just protecting a species from scientific scrutiny. He was protecting a people, a culture with traditions, ethics, education systems, and spiritual practices from the catastrophic disruption that contact with human civilization would inevitably bring. Every contacted, isolated human culture has been devastated, he said. Language loss, disease, displacement, psychological trauma. Why would this be different? Because they're not anatomically identical to us. That's the worst possible reason. Their difference makes them more vulnerable, not less. The ethical imperative became clear. His silence was not a withholding of knowledge. It was an act of respect for autonomous intelligence that had chosen isolation, had maintained their hidden existence through adaptation and caution, and had earned the right to remain undiscovered. The unraveling began in February 2018, though Dr. Werner didn't recognize the warning signs at first. A new employee at the U.S. Forest Service, an ambitious wildlife manager named Marcus Reeves, had been assigned to the district that encompassed Dr. Werner's study area. Reeves had a reputation for aggressive management, a belief that all wildlife populations should be cataloged, monitored, and controlled. He came to my property 3 times that spring, Dr. Werner recalled. Official courtesy visits, he called them, asking about my land use, my activities, whether I'd seen anything unusual. I played the hermit role, polite but disinterested, offered coffee, answered questions vaguely. But Reeves had noticed anomalies in the wildlife population data. Deer numbers were stable despite minimal natural predation evidence. Camera trap studies showed avoidance patterns that didn't match known predator territories. And locals had submitted 3 separate reports of unusual vocalizations and large track findings in a concentrated area, right in Dr. Werner's study zone. He thought I was poaching, Dr. Werner said with a bitter laugh. That was his initial theory, that I was illegally hunting and somehow manipulating the ecosystem. He started investigating me through that lens, which actually bought me time. Wrong suspicion, wrong direction. By summer 2018, Reeves had escalated his investigation. He obtained permits to conduct his own camera trap study in the area, positioning equipment throughout the forest without notifying Dr. Werner. Within 2 months, his cameras captured something he couldn't explain. A bipedal figure, approximately 7 feet tall, examining one of his cameras before turning it to face a tree. They knew what he was doing, Dr. Werner said. They were habituated to my equipment, but new cameras, new scent, new presence, they recognized the threat. And instead of just avoiding the cameras, they sent a message. We see you. We know what you're doing. We're intelligent enough to redirect your surveillance. Reeves's response was predictable. He filed reports with his supervisors, contacted cryptozoology research groups, and began pushing for an official investigation. By September, the first outside researchers arrived, a team from a private cryptozoology foundation with funding and equipment and enthusiasm that set off every alarm in Dr. Werner's mind. I went to them, he said. I broke my own rule about invisibility. I introduced myself as the local property owner, told them I was a retired biologist, offered to share my knowledge of the local ecosystem. I thought maybe I could steer them away, provide natural explanations for their findings. redirect their search areas. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Chen, was too experienced, too perceptive. She noticed Dr. Werner's equipment was far too sophisticated for a casual hobbyist. She observed his intimate knowledge of game trails, water sources, and animal behavior patterns, and she recognized the careful way he avoided specific locations, places she'd already identified as interesting based on her own preliminary research. She confronted me on the third day of their expedition, Dr. Werner said. Asked me directly, "You know something you're not sharing. You've been here long enough to have seen things. Why are you lying?" He remembered standing in the forest with Dr. Chen, the autumn leaves gold and red around them, facing the choice he'd avoided for 23 years. Tell the truth and betray the trust he'd built, or maintain the lie and watch as others pushed forward with less careful, less ethical approaches. I told her I believed there was something in these woods worth protecting, and that protection meant leaving it alone, he said. I didn't confirm what it was, but I didn't have to. She understood what I wasn't saying. Dr. Chen's response surprised him. She called off her team, packed up equipment, and left within 24 hours. But before she departed, she gave Dr. Werner a warning. Other people are coming. People less interested in protection than proof. I can control my team, but I can't stop what's already been set in motion. Whatever you're guarding, the window for secrecy is closing. She was right. By October, 3 more research groups had obtained permits. Local attention was building. An amateur cryptid hunter with a popular YouTube channel announced plans to live stream an expedition. The forest that had been silent and safe for 25 years was suddenly under siege. Dr. Werner's health was also failing. The Parkinson's diagnosis had come 2 years earlier, and the tremors were worsening. His ability to maintain the equipment network, to move through the forest undetected, to sustain the hermit existence, all of it was deteriorating. I realized I was the only barrier between them and discovery, he said, and that barrier was crumbling. I needed a plan for what happened after me. I needed someone to inherit the responsibility. That's when he reached out to me. We'd worked together 15 years earlier on a wolf reintroduction study. He'd kept minimal contact over the years. A Christmas card, occasional email, but I'd remembered him as brilliant, ethical, meticulous. When his encrypted message arrived asking me to visit on a matter of urgent scientific importance, I couldn't refuse. I had 3 weeks with you before it ended, he said during my visit. I needed you to see everything, understand everything, inherit everything. The decision of what to do with this knowledge, that's yours now. I'm done. I'm too sick, too tired, too old to keep fighting. He showed me everything that October. The footage, the recordings, the documentation of 25 years. The graves, the exchange sites, the shelter locations. He taught me how to move through the forest, how to read the signs, how to respect the boundaries. This isn't just data I'm giving you, he said on my last evening there. This is trust. Their trust in me, which I'm transferring to you without their consent. That's the arrogance I've lived with. That's the burden you're inheriting. 3 weeks after I left, on November 3, 2018, federal agents arrived with warrants. Someone, possibly Reeves, possibly one of the researchers, had filed reports suggesting illegal wildlife research and failure to report endangered species contact. They took everything: the computers, the hard drives, the physical documentation, the equipment. They took Dr. Werner into custody, charged him with multiple violations of federal wildlife protection statutes, but they didn't take the backup system, the encrypted files I'd helped him hide off-site, the copied hard drives buried in weatherproof containers in 3 separate locations, the archive that I'd already downloaded to my own secure servers. Let them have what's in the cabin, he'd told me. Let them think they've found everything. The important work, that's already out. That's already protected. That's with you. The raid on Dr. Werner's cabin occurred at dawn on November 3, 2018. 12 agents from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, accompanied by local law enforcement and a forensics team, descended on the property with military precision. They had warrants, legal authority, and the conviction that they were uncovering illegal wildlife research that posed risks to undocumented endangered species. What they didn't expect was that they were being watched. I learned about this later from multiple sources: official reports, leaked documents, and testimony from one of the agents who struggled with what happened that day and eventually reached out to me. The events of that morning became classified almost immediately, and everyone involved was required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. According to Agent Sarah Martinez, who I interviewed 2 years later. The operation began routinely. They documented the cabin's contents, photographed equipment, began cataloging Dr. Werner's computer systems and research materials. Dr. Werner himself was calm, cooperative, almost relieved. He told us we were too late, Martinez recalled. He said the important work was already safe and what we were taking was just shadows of knowledge that belonged to someone else. We thought he was being poetic, eccentric old scientist making dramatic statements. The cataloging process took 4 hours. As morning progressed toward noon, agents worked inside the cabin while law enforcement maintained perimeter security. That's when the first sounds started, vocalizations from the surrounding forest, coming from multiple directions, unlike anything the agents had heard before. It sounded like howling, but wrong, Martinez said. Too complex, too varied, and coordinated. We'd hear one from the north, then an answer from the south, then another from the east. It felt like being surrounded by something that was communicating about us. The team leader ordered everyone inside the cabin while they assessed the situation. They thought wolves, possibly a large pack exhibiting unusual behavior. Martinez, who had field experience with wolf populations, knew immediately it wasn't canine predator behavior. Through the cabin windows, several agents reported seeing movement in the tree line, large shapes, bipedal posture, always at the edge of visibility. Cameras were deployed, but the figures stayed just beyond clear documentation range. They wanted us to see them without seeing them, Martinez said. They were making a statement. You're in our territory. You're taking something that isn't yours, and we're watching. Dr. Werner, still in custody inside his own cabin, sat calmly at his kitchen table. When the team leader asked if he knew what was out there, he simply said, "They're wondering if I'm safe. They're trying to understand what you're doing and why." "They who?" the agent demanded. "The neighbors," Dr. Werner replied. The vocalizations continued for 3 hours, rising and falling but maintaining constant presence. No aggressive approach, no direct confrontation, but unmistakable surveillance. The psychological effect on the agents was profound. Trained professionals, armed and numerous, feeling increasingly uncomfortable in broad daylight in a Michigan forest. Around 3 p.m., the team leader made the decision to evacuate with what they'd already collected. They loaded Dr. Werner and the seized materials into vehicles and prepared to depart. That's when the most remarkable event occurred. As the convoy prepared to leave, 6 figures emerged from the forest and positioned themselves across the access road, the only route out. They stood approximately 50 yards ahead of the vehicles, visible but not approaching, effectively blocking passage without aggressive action. "I've never seen anything like it in my life," Martinez testified. They were huge, 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, faces that they weren't bear, weren't wolf, weren't human, but somehow all of those. They just stood there, watching us, waiting. The team leader ordered them to stand down, to clear the road. The figures didn't move. He considered attempting to drive through, but recognized the insanity of that action. Whatever these beings were, they weren't yielding, and force would likely result in tragedy for everyone involved. They were at an impasse for nearly 45 minutes. The agents radioed for additional support, but backup was hours away. The afternoon was aging, and no one wanted to be in that situation after dark. Dr. Werner finally spoke up. "Let me talk to them." After heated debate, they allowed it. Dr. Werner, still in custody but temporarily released from the vehicle, walked forward alone toward the line of figures. He stopped 20 feet away, deliberately maintaining distance, and did something the agents found bizarre. He made a series of gestures, hand signs that looked almost like sign language, but weren't any recognized human system. One of the figures, the largest, clearly the leader, responded with similar gestures. A conversation was happening, conducted in silence through movement and posture. After approximately 5 minutes, Dr. Werner turned and walked back to the agents. "They'll let you leave with me and with the materials you've taken, but they want something in return." "We don't negotiate with animals," the team leader responded. "Then you'll be here until dark," Dr. Werner said calmly, "and I promise you, you don't want that." Eventually, pragmatism won. What do they want? They want you to understand that what you've taken is sacred to them. Those recordings, those documents, that's their history, their lives, their privacy. They're allowing you to take it because they trust that eventually humans will learn to leave them alone. They're asking you to honor that trust. The team leader agreed, though it's unclear if he truly understood what he was agreeing to. Dr. Werner turned back to the figures and made a final gesture, hand over heart, then extended outward. The figures stepped off the road and melted back into the forest. The convoy left without further incident, but every agent in those vehicles was permanently changed. They had encountered intelligence that didn't fit any category they understood, had witnessed communication that transcended species, had felt the weight of being judged by consciousness they couldn't classify. The official report listed the incident as unusual wildlife encounter, likely bear behavior misinterpreted due to low light conditions and stress. But Martinez and 3 other agents refused to sign off on that conclusion. They demanded accurate reporting, were told such reporting was not in the public interest, and were eventually transferred to different posts or pressured into early retirement. The footage captured by cabin security cameras and agent body cameras was classified immediately. The files seized from Dr. Werner's cabin were sent to a federal facility where they remain locked under national security protocols, ostensibly because they contain information pertinent to unidentified biological entities potentially relevant to biosecurity concerns. Dr. Werner was transferred to federal custody, held for 3 months while charges were prepared, then suddenly released on medical grounds due to his advancing Parkinson's disease. He died 6 months later, and the official cause was listed as pneumonia, though Martinez later told me he'd simply stopped fighting, stopped eating, stopped engaging, stopped wanting to continue in a world where the work of his lifetime had been seized and silenced. But the truth is, Dr. Werner won. The confrontation on that road wasn't defeat. It was his final act of protection. The beings he'd studied had revealed themselves not as creatures to be captured or specimens to be studied, but as people with agency, intelligence, and the right to privacy. Every agent who witnessed that encounter would carry the memory forever, would question the official narrative, would understand at a fundamental level that something remarkable existed in those forests, something deserving of respect rather than scrutiny. And the work, the real work, was already safe, in encrypted files, in buried hard drives, in the testimony I carried. The archive lived on, waiting for a future where humanity might be ready to know without needing to possess. I'm writing this 3 years after Dr. Samuel Werner's death, from a location I won't disclose, having spent that time reviewing 25 years of documentation and wrestling with the same question that tormented him. What do we do with knowledge that serves no good purpose being revealed? The archive remains secure, encrypted, distributed across multiple backup systems. I've added my own observations to it, documentation of the study area in the years since the raid, evidence that the population persists despite the disruption, and recordings that suggest they've adapted to the increased human attention by retreating deeper into remaining wilderness corridors. I've also documented what happened to the humans involved in Dr. Werner's story. Marcus Reeves left the Forest Service within a year of the raid, citing personal reasons, though colleagues reported he'd become obsessed with what he'd briefly seen on surveillance footage before the files were classified. He now works in private sector forestry management, far from Michigan, and refuses to discuss his time in the Upper Peninsula. Dr. Patricia Chen, the cryptozoology researcher who'd shown Dr. Werner mercy by withdrawing her team, sent me a letter shortly after his death. In it, she wrote, "I've spent my career searching for proof of the extraordinary. Your friend showed me that sometimes the most extraordinary thing we can do is choose not to prove what we've found. I've stopped searching. I now focus on habitat protection, nameless, thankless work that might preserve spaces for beings we officially refuse to acknowledge but ethically cannot ignore." Sarah Martinez, the federal agent who witnessed the road confrontation, eventually left government service and now works in wildlife rehabilitation. When I met her in 2021, she told me, "That day changed my understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and our human obligation to life we don't fully comprehend. I can't talk about what I saw. Legal agreements prevent that. But I can work every day to protect habitat, to preserve wilderness, to ensure that if there are beings out there who've chosen invisibility, we honor that choice by leaving them space to remain unseen." The study area itself has seen changes. The increased attention following the raid led to designation of parts of the forest as protected wilderness. Ironically, the publicity around the mysterious wildlife research case resulted in conservation victories that might never have occurred otherwise. Logging operations were halted, development projects were denied, and a 12-square-mile corridor now exists under federal protection. I've returned to the area twice, always carefully, always respectfully. I don't attempt contact. That would be a violation of everything Dr. Werner taught me, but I've maintained the equipment network he established, checking the remote monitoring stations, downloading the recordings that continue to accumulate. They're still there. The vocalizations persist. The tracks appear after snow and rain. The exchange site that Dr. Werner maintained for 20 years remains undisturbed. I've left small offerings a few times, never expecting reciprocation, simply honoring the tradition he'd established. Once I found a single eagle feather placed on the offering stone. I don't know if it was left deliberately or arrived by chance. The uncertainty is appropriate. I've also documented something Dr. Werner never witnessed: juvenile vocalizations, suggesting successful reproduction, suggesting the population isn't just surviving, but maintaining generational continuity. That small piece of evidence gives me hope that his silence served its purpose. As for the archive, I've made arrangements similar to Dr. Werner's: multiple trustees, encrypted time-release protocols, conditions that must be met before any information is revealed. I've added one criterion he didn't include: evidence that humanity has developed ethical frameworks for encountering non-human intelligence that prioritize the autonomy and dignity of the encountered beings, rather than human curiosity or scientific ambition. We're not there yet. We can barely manage ethical relationships with human populations who differ from dominant cultures. Our track record with other intelligent species, great apes, cetaceans, elephants, is one of captivity, experimentation, and habitat destruction justified by research value or economic benefit. Until we can demonstrate we've evolved beyond those patterns, the archive remains sealed. But I'm aware of the counter-argument. Some would say that secrecy is itself unethical, that knowledge belongs to humanity, that science requires transparency, that protecting the unknown potentially prevents understanding that could lead to broader conservation benefits. To them, I offer Dr. Werner's question: what do we owe to intelligence that doesn't want to be known? If a population has successfully maintained hidden existence through their own adaptation and intelligence, if they've demonstrated clear desire for privacy through consistent avoidance behavior, if they've shown themselves capable of sophisticated reasoning about contact with humans, don't they have the right to choose invisibility? The Western philosophical tradition struggles with this question because it's built on assumptions of human centrality and the inherent value of knowledge. But indigenous traditions around the world have long recognized that some knowledge is meant to remain with specific peoples, that revelation can be violation, that respect sometimes means accepting that there are things we aren't meant to understand. Dr. Werner's work stands as testament to a different kind of science, one that observes without possessing, documents without exposing, learns without exploiting. He proved that rigorous methodology and ethical restraint aren't contradictory. He showed that the most profound discoveries might be the ones we choose not to publish. His legacy isn't the creature he studied. His legacy is the question he left us. What kind of humans do we want to be in a world we're finally beginning to understand we share with other forms of consciousness? I think about that question every time I review his files, every time I hear those vocalizations on the monitoring recordings, every time I stand in the Michigan forest and feel the presence of something watching, evaluating, choosing whether to remain hidden or reveal themselves. So far, they choose hidden, and I choose to honor that choice. There are still places in this world where mysteries persist not because we lack the technology to solve them, but because some things deserve to remain mysterious. There are still beings who move through our forests in silence, whose intelligence we can only glimpse, whose lives continue independent of human knowledge or approval. And there are still a few humans who understand that the greatest discovery we can make isn't proof of the extraordinary, but wisdom about when to leave the extraordinary alone. Dr. Samuel Werner was one of those humans. In his memory, I remain another. The archive is secure, the forest is protected, the beings persist, and some secrets remain secret not because we can't reveal them, but because we choose not to. That choice is the most human thing we can do.